And welcome back here to Live Now from Fox. I'm Andrew Kraft. Let's move on to more of these now international headlines. And our next story takes us to Ukraine and an update on the war with Russia there. A Russian ballistic missile strike on the northeastern Ukrainian city of Sumy has left at least 32 civilians dead and 99 injured. That's according to President Volodymyr Zelensky and government officials. According to the Financial Times, their families and children were filmed lying lifeless on the streets with buildings destroyed and cars in flames a week before Easter, when Christians today all around the world were celebrating Palm Sunday here. What we want to do is let you listen to this message by Volodymyr Zelensky just from today. This is his reaction to this strike on one of these cities in his country. Here's what he had to say.
Суми. Станом на цей час відомо про 34 убитих людини. Мої співчуття усім рідним та близьким. Це були 2 російські балістичні ракети. Перша влучила в будівлю, одна з будівель університету. Друга розірвалась фактично над вулицею. 117 людей були поранені, в тому числі діти, і, зокрема, дівчинка 25-го року народження. Лікарі, всі медичні працівники роблять максимум, щоб допомогти, щоб якнайбільше врятувати. Я вдячний всім службам, які за лічені хвилини були на місці, які почали рятувальні роботи. Удар прийшовся просто по центру міста у вербну неділю. Тільки абсолютно відбита сволота може робити таке. Сьогодні багато лідерів держав, дипломатів, багато звичайних людей з великим серцем висловили свої співчуття Україні, українцям. Засудили російський удар. Вже є заяви лідерів і голів урядів Франції, Британії, Німеччини, Данії, Фінляндії, Польщі, очільників Євросоюзу, держави Балтії, Литва, Латвія, Естонія. Я вдячний прем'єр-міністру Хорватії та Болгарії, президенції Молдови, прем'єр-міністру Нідерландів, президенту Словаччини, прем'єр-міністру Швеції. Я впевнений, буде підтримка інших багатьох лідерів. Я хотів би подякувати кожному і кожній, хто пам'ятає, що війни закінчуються, коли про злочини війни не забувають. І коли на агресора тиснуть достатньо, саме цього зараз немає. Цієї п'ятниці був рівно місяць, як Росія відкинула американську пропозицію повного і безумовного припинення вогню. Вони не бояться, і саме тому балістика. Саме тому щоночі під сотню ударних дронів, більшість з яких шахеди. І саме проти звичайних українських міст. Продовжуються і російські штурми на фронті, вони не перестають атакувати та не перестають поширювати ненависть в своїй державній пропаганді. Тільки тиском, тільки рішучими діями це можна змінити. Кожна російська балістика, кожна крилата ракета, всі російські шахеди, всі керовані бомби б'ють не тільки по наших людях, по наших громадах, але й по дипломатії, по політиці кожного, хто дійсно намагається все це завершити. Ми будемо робити все і надалі, щоб захистити людей і життя. Я дякую всім країнам і лідерам, які допомагають нам. І дуже важливі цього тижня були рішення щодо нових пакетів підтримки України після Рамштайну і на двосторонній основі. Україна обов'язково вистоїть, ми обов'язково дамо для нашої держави, для наших людей надійні гарантії безпеки. І обов'язково пам'ятаємо, лише разом ми достатньо сильні, щоб досягти своїх цілей. Я дякую всім, хто сьогодні з Сумами. Дякую всім, хто підтримує одне одного, хто робить все для захисту та зміцнення України, українців. Слава Україні!
All right, that was the message there from Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelensky on this Palm Sunday attack on his country by Russian strikes there. This was a photo from the scene he posted on social media. Take a look at that. He says, as of now, 31 people are known to have been killed in Sumy by the Russian ballistic missile strike there. He says among those killed were 2 children. He says his condolences to the families and loved ones. He said more than 84 people have been wounded, including 10 children. Also a message there from President Trump's special envoy on Russia and Ukraine, Keith Kellogg. He says this: today's Palm Sunday attack by Russian forces on civilian targets in Sumy crosses any line of decency. There are scores of civilian dead and wounded. As a former military leader, I understand targeting, and this is wrong. It is why President Trump is working hard to end this war. In the meantime here, we do want to bring into the conversation right now our friend and colleague there, national security analyst and expert, and retired Marine intelligence officer Hal Kempfer, but also retired Rear Admiral there, Mark Montgomery, with the Foundation for Defense of Democracy. Gentlemen, thanks for being with us here on this Sunday. Hal, I'll start with you. You and I have discussed so many of these talks, so many of these negotiations between all sides here to try to bring this conflict to an end. What is Putin thinking? How does this help foster or generate more negotiations? It doesn't, right?
Andrew, I don't see any way this really helps. In fact, if anything, it somewhat emboldens the side which is kind of pushing back on Russia right now. Certainly, you saw the Steve Witkoff discussion that took place last Friday in St. Petersburg. Putin was there, and it sounded like the U.S. was kind of adopting what Russia had proposed as taking over all these oblasts. Now you have what I'm going to call a terror attack. It's not necessarily a terrorist attack by definition, but a terror attack, which is what the Russians do. That is the Russian and Soviet way of warfare. That is how they do stuff, is they try to intimidate, coerce the civilian population. That's just part of their kit bag of things they do. And they use these ballistic missiles, which I think the choice of weaponry is key in this, and going after civilian targets. I think Keith Kellogg, I think some others are going to have a stronger voice, certainly in the White House, in terms of going forward.
Mark, I want to pose the question now to you here. Is this a red line for the Trump administration? Why negotiate or deal with Russian officials any further after what we just saw? Shouldn't there be red lines here?
Well, Andrew, I think you're exactly right. I agree with Hal's assessment of it. And I'll say at this point, the Trump administration, for lack of a better description, has put out the velvet glove to Putin. They have not brought heavy pressure on him like they did on President Zelensky. And Witkoff, the lead U.S. negotiator, has been awfully soft with President Putin. And look what that's gotten us. A Palm Sunday attack on a clearly civilian piece of infrastructure, as Hal said, a terror, maybe not terrorism, but a terror attack. Iskander missiles against predominantly civilian targets, totally inappropriate. It's time for the United States to bring, the hammer down, really the steel anvil down on the Russians, and do a much better job of pressuring the Russians to enter into legitimate negotiations with the United States. The velvet glove has not worked. It's time for the hammer, and it's time to be more aggressive in our treatment of Vladimir Putin and his authoritarian regime.
So, Hal, you and I talked in the immediate aftermath of the talks in Jeddah after this partial ceasefire agreement was agreed to by both sides here, brokered by the United States and the Saudis, that there would be no more strikes on the electrical grid and critical infrastructure in Ukraine, but also on Black Sea ports and Black Sea shipping as well. From what I understand, that has not gone into effect just yet here. But to Mark's point, none of those targets were in Sumy this morning. Clearly civilian targets that Russia keeps doing, as they have done throughout the course of this war for 3+ years. So how do you get Putin to bend? I mean, what does the president need to do? Mark was describing this as a kind of velvet glove approach here, and you and I have discussed this too. What has Putin had to concede here in any of these negotiations?
I think the words "not much" come immediately to mind. He's basically gone in there and thrown out, here's our talking points. And unfortunately, Steve Witkoff has started repeating those talking points, which is very frustrating. Very different from what General Keith Kellogg says. Very different approach from that. And with that, yes. And by the way, both sides point to each other's side, but really, Russia's been doing a lot of disinformation, pointing to the Ukrainians, saying, "Oh, they're attacking our energy infrastructure. They're doing this." There is no agreement that's really in place, although they're both talking about the parameters of what you just described in terms of, going after energy infrastructure and a variety of other targets. Civilian targets like this, no, they weren't part of that agreement. But it's a higher importance. This is a violation of the law of war. This is a violation of the Geneva Convention. There is no ambiguity on this. This is the sort of stuff that at the end of World War II, we would have tribunals. We would charge, Japanese or German officers, and sometimes they get the death penalty for things like this.
Yeah.
This is a bigger thing than just going after energy infrastructure. They are specifically using these huge Iskander ballistic missiles. Just to give you an idea of this, we're talking 1,000 to 1,500 pound warheads. These things are enormous, cause tremendous destructive force, and they're going after blatantly civilian targets. The bus, horrific, but also going after a university. There really isn't much excuse for that. I'm hoping when this is all said and done, somebody gets charged with this in some international court, but I'm somewhat skeptical that will happen. But it is absolutely a violation of the law of war, and it's bigger than just the ceasefire parameters, if you will.
So, Mark and Hal, you would agree with me. This is not new throughout the course of this war. Yes, we have not seen it in some time there, but this is not new. And Mark, to you, Steve Witkoff met with Vladimir Putin in St. Petersburg on Friday. Putin's spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, he described the ongoing talks as, quote unquote, painstaking work. He said Russia and the U.S. needed, quote, more work and more time before their relations could be restored here. Also, Steve Witkoff visited a synagogue and an Orthodox Christian cathedral while in St. Petersburg, and you saw the video exchange of them. Clearly, Witkoff is not putting enough pressure on Putin. I mean, why would Putin decide to strike this city on Palm Sunday, mere days after meeting with the U.S. representative here? What message does that send?
Well, as I said, this is not good negotiating tactics. We are not practicing a maximum pressure campaign against Russia. We practiced one against Ukraine, got them to the negotiating position, and one that I think was a reasonable deal, along with the critical minerals deal for the United States. We have not done the same to Russia. To do this, I think at this point, we're going to have to bring significant increased economic sanctions against Russia, against their banking system, secondary sanctions against those taking oil from the shadow fleet, so India and China, cut off Putin's access to funds from the sale of fossil fuels, oil and natural gas. That's 30 to 40% of his economy, and his economy is spending 40% of its money on defense. If we can cut that money off, Putin will have to make compromises, either in the war effort or in support to his base. And I think in the end, that's what gets him to the negotiating table.
Hal, you and I have discussed so much somewhat of the creative, novel approaches Trump is taking to foreign policy vis-a-vis Gaza and also Ukraine. Remember the Oval Office blow-up between Zelensky, Trump, and Vance as well. What about now? Isn't now time for creative, novel approaches here with regard to Ukraine here? I mean, should Trump get on the phone with Zelensky, offer condolences? Many have offered condolences online and on social media here. But with the pressure on Ukraine specifically to make concessions, it has not been equal. Now should it be more in Russia's direction after today?
Well, I think the president should look at what President Macron said, what Keir Starmer said. A number of other leaders have expressed outrage at what was done, also condolences to the Ukrainian people. So I think on that point, absolutely. But to Mark's point, I absolutely, go after him on the financial side and really stop the movement of funds back to Russia. But the big part of that is those secondary sanctions. Stop that dark tanker fleet from doing what it's doing. By the way, that dark tanker fleet isn't just harming or causing problems in Ukraine. It's causing maritime security and safety problems worldwide with these old tankers going through dangerous zones, running dark without their AIS or identification system turned on. So if we could put secondary sanctions on China, and I think the gloves are off on China at this point, and I think we've also been very direct with India. These are the two biggest consumers of Russian oil. If we can do that, I think that would be the big move, if you will, the next step that would put tremendous pressure on Russia to come to, serious negotiations, I would say.
So, Mark, there was a moment in late February and early March when most of our coverage here was about the war in Ukraine, about the talks that were happening in Riyadh and Jeddah and Saudi Arabia, the Oval Office meeting between Trump and Zelensky, Trump even, musing about inviting Vladimir Putin to Washington as these talks got underway. And then a full ceasefire was put on the table. Ukraine agreed to that, unconditional. Russia has not. And then there was a partial ceasefire put on the table. All sides agreed to that. It hasn't been implemented just yet. Where do we go from here in this conflict? Are we at some type of weird status quo? Not much has happened. And then this attack on Sumy happens overnight.
Well, there's a risk if we don't do a maximum pressure campaign, which is the sanctions that I mentioned and Hal mentioned, and then also readdress our support. In other words, continue to provide imagery, which we provide, which gives them warning, but also gives them targeting, and then consider providing them more defensive weapons. The reason the Iskanders are getting through, the reason more of their cruise missiles are getting through, is that our provision of Patriot missiles for our Patriot systems and AMRAAM missiles for our NASAM systems has slowed. We need to increase our supply of these defensive systems, and then I'd also consider beginning to resupply ATACMS or a long-range strike weapon. Do these kind of things, incrementally, one after another, so Vladimir Putin can see the increasing pressure campaign coming from the United States, augmented by serious amounts of European funds as well. And the way this gets to a cessation is Putin feels enough pressure that he negotiates in what his version of good faith, which is not good faith, but at least gets you a cessation of hostilities.
Hal, final word.
I would say, Mark brings up a great point. It's not just that we provide the systems; it's the ammunition. All right, it's the munitions. It's those ATACMS missiles. It's those Patriot missiles in addition to the systems. And I'm going to say something, and I've said this before. I think that was a good time to put some pressure on South Korea. They have phenomenal war reserves in terms of artillery ammunition, well beyond what they actually need, that could be moved to Ukraine. And you saw the Czechs being very aggressive on getting artillery ammunition to Ukraine. I think all the munitions issues are big, and these munitions issues go right into the thinking process, the observe, orient, decide, action process, if you will, of Putin, when he's figuring out his next moves, and particularly if he wants to get serious about negotiating some sort of ceasefire.
All right. Hal Kempfer, Mark Montgomery, can't thank you enough. Thanks for joining us on this Sunday, detailing this just horrific attack there in Ukraine. We'll talk soon.